Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's tutorial. Today we want to begin our journey with the respiratory system. For respiratory system, we have the conduction zone and the respiratory zone. We want to start with the conduction zone, actually with the nasal cavity and the pharynx. Remember that the air which is inspired, yes, will contain several things which may not, augur well for the respiratory portion, yes, of the respiratory system. Therefore, we'll have to be well conditioned before it gets there. Therefore, conditioning the air will be the main function of the conduction portion of the respiratory system. And this conditioning of air will include, yes, humidifying it, yes, warming it, yes, removing particulate matter. Even some of them are going to help in even voice articulation, which will be, the main function of the voice box, the larynx, which we'll look at that one later. But for today, we want to look at, the nasal cavity and the pharynx. So, without wasting much time, let's look at, what we have to learn about the nasal cavity and the pharynx. All right, so this is the nose, okay? And we are going to have an opening of the nose, which represents what we call the external nares, or that is the nostrils. There are two nostrils. In between them will be a cartilage, a cartilaginous structure, which there will be a septum, the nasal septum, and this nasal septum, which we already looked at, will contain a bony component as well as a cartilaginous component. The bony component will have the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid superiorly, and of course we are also going to have the vomer inferiorly, and it will be completed in the living by the septal cartilage. Now, if you look at the nasal cavity, we will have this area which is actually continuous with the external skin, which we call it the vestibule of the nasal cavity, the vestibule of the nasal cavity. Because it's continuous with the skin, it's going to be stratified, squamous, keratinized epithelium, and it's also going to bear some coarse hair, which we call them vibrissae, coarse hair made of actually vibrissae. And yes, this area we've seen, and then we also have at this portion, which we will call it the respiratory portion. So apart from the vestibule, which is the opening into the nasal cavity, we're also going to have the respiratory portion, and this area will be lined by what we call pseudostratified by the respiratory epithelium, which we learned is going to be pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue with actually numerous goblet cells as well as cilia, and so this area, and of course superiorly around this area we are going to have what we call the olfactory portion, which is going to be relevant in smelling, and therefore will be lined by pseudostratified the olfactory epithelium being the pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue with microvilli or brush border, and going to help in that regard. Now, of course, we are going to also have the posterior portion, which will communicate with the pharynx, being the posterior nasal aperture. Actually, the poena will be here. Now, what we find is that, yes, the floor of the nasal cavity, which actually forms the roof of this nasal cavity, of this oral cavity, which we'll come to later, will be by what we call the palate. And that is the hard palate, and of course, this is the soft palate. Now you realize that the hard palate is bony and will be formed actually by the palatine process, yes, of what we call the maxillary bone, and of course, the horizontal plate of the palatine bone will form it. Now you realize that of course for the roof we are going to find the sphenoid, the sphenoidal bone, the body of the sphenoid. Of course, we're also going to communicate here by what we call the ethmoidal bone. Actually the cribriform plate of the ethmoidal bone, perpendicular plate, the plate of the ethmoidal bone, that's the horizontal plate. And then we're also going to have what we call the frontal bone. Yes, around this area, the frontal bone will also communicate, superiorly with it. Now, what we find is that in the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, we are going to find some shelf-like, projections which are bony, and these are known as the concha. So we're going to have what we call the inferior nasal concha, the middle, and of course the superior nasal concha. You realize that the inferior is the largest and the smallest one being the superior nasal concha. Now we've seen that of course the inferior nasal concha is going to be a separate bone on its own. The middle as well as superior nasal concha are going to be parts of the ethmoid bone, and so that's what we are going to find over here. Now what they do is that in the living they will be covered by mucous membrane, and therefore they will help quell the air, so they will cause turbulence in the air, so that the air which is inspired will have several surfaces which will help, so that it helps in the conditioning of the air. It can be well conditioned. So as the air enters, they cause it to slow down, and they also cause turbulence in it, so that there will be large surface area for conditioning of the air. Because they're able to cause turbulence, they are also known as turbinates. So you have inferior, of course, middle and superior turbinates, as well. That's what we also find. Now, actually, the nasal cavity is well vascularized. It's well vascularized by several blood vessels. Importantly, around the anterior inferior part of this nasal cavity, around this area, which we call it Little's area, because there's rich anastomosis over here, which we call it Kesselbeck's, plexus, Kesselbeck's plexus. And this, Kesselbeck's, plexus is actually going to be formed by rich blood supply of the septal branch of the superior labial artery, actually a branch of the facial artery. Then, of course, we're also going to have what we call anterior and posterior branches, of the ethmoidal artery, yes, which are actually branches of the ophthalmic, artery. Yes, so that is what we are going to find. Apart from that, even we have what we call the sphenopalatine artery, going to help form a rich, anastomosis around this area. And that is why this area is more prone to bleeding, by way of epistaxis. A lot of bleeding can occur here. So that's what we find. Now, what we find is that beneath these conchae, beneath them, we are going to have some meatus's. So beneath the inferior concha, we are going to have an inferior nasal meatus, a middle, and of course superior nasal meatus will be found here. So between the roof of the oral cavity, or the floor of the nasal cavity, that's the palate, and the inferior nasal concha, we are going to have what we call inferior nasal meatus. And this inferior nasal meatus, yes, what it's going to do is that it's going to help, it's going to, provide opening for what we call the nasolacrimal duct. Now remember that we said that, the tear that is produced, by the lacrimal glands will eventually get into the nasal cavity via the nasolacrimal duct. It will actually open in the inferior nasal meatus, and this opening will be guarded, actually by what we call the lacrimal fold, or something we call the Hasner's, valve will help, guard it. So over here between, of course, the inferior nasal concha and the middle nasal concha, we will have this, meatus as well, which will be the middle nasal meatus. And the middle nasal meatus, importantly, will have a mucosal elevation, which is known as bulla ethmoidalis, or ethmoidal bulla. Yes, this bulla ethmoidalis, yes, will have, its anterior aspect. Yes, its anterior aspect is going to bear what we call the, hiatus, what we call semilunaris, which is slit-like. Below it will have this, hiatus semilunaris. And anteriorly to this, bulla ethmoidalis, we are going to bear what we call infundibulum, and this infundibulum is going to help, to actually bring in what we call the frontal air sinus, the anterior, frontal air sinuses. So it will communicate with the frontal air sinuses. So that's what we are going to find over here, frontal air sinuses. Yes, we'll communicate with it. Okay, and then apart from that, yes, in front of this, actually in the semilunaris, the hiatus semilunaris, we're also going to find what we call the maxillary air sinuses also opening into it. That's what we are going to find. Then, of course, we are also going to find, what we call the superior nasal meatus. For the superior nasal meatus, yes, we are going to find, what we call, the posterior air sinuses. Okay, posterior air sinus is actually coming from, the ethmoid, actually opening into it, Posterior air sinuses, ethmoidal air sinuses, actually opening into it. Then this area, yes, we will call it what we call sphenoethmoidal recess. This is the sphenoethmoidal recess. Yes, of course, this is the sphenoid bone, the body of the sphenoid, and this is the ethmoid, so sphenoethmoidal recess. And this sphenoethmoidal recess will be the opening for the sphenoidal, air sinuses. Opening for sphenoidal air sinuses. So that's what we will find over here. Of course, by way of sinuses, you realize that we are going to find, yes, the sphenoidal air sinus. We are going to find, yes, the frontal air sinus over here. And of course, we talk about the cubiform plate of the ethmoid. Yes, that's the crystal galley. So that's what we are finding over here. So that's mainly what we have to, understand as regards, this nasal cavity, But we realize that there is, a small connection. Sorry, there is a small connection actually between, the maxilla, or the hard palate portion, the maxilla over here, actually the central incisor around that area. We have, the incisive canal communicating, serving as a link between the nasal cavity, inferior portion of the nasal cavity, and the superior portion of the oral cavity. We have what we call the incisive canal, And of course, this incisive canal will contain what we call the nasopalatine nerve, as well as, the anastomosis between what we call the greater palatine and the sphenopalatine arteries. So importantly will be the nerve known as, the nasopalatine nerve. So that's what we find here. Now, moving away from this area, we have what we call the pharynx. Now, the pharynx is how we're going to begin, which is about, approximately 12 centimeters long. We'll actually begin from the base of skull, actually the body of the sphenoid area, all the way to the inferior border of the cricoid cartilage, of the larynx. And it's also associated with, actually, yes, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and of course the cysts, the inferior border of the cysts, body of the cysts, cervical vertebrae. The cyst cervical vertebrae is where, it's going to end. So, but this pharynx is actually demarcated, given three, description can be divided into three portions. The portion which will run from the base of skull, actually from, the sphenoid, body of sphenoid, all the way to the inferior border of the uvula of the soft palate, is known as the nasopharynx. And it's named based on, what the structure that, this portion of the pharynx is found behind. So it is finding itself behind, the nasal cavity. We are going to call it the nasopharynx. So the nasal cavity is going to communicate with it. Then we have that portion which will begin from the inferior border of, the uvula of the soft palate, all the way to, actually, to the upper portion of, the epiglottis, which is an elastic cartilage, epiglottis of, the larynx. Then this area, because it's communicating with the oral cavity, we are going to call it oropharynx. Remember that the nasopharynx is going to have what we call, pseudostratified columnar, epithelial tissues with goblet cells, and of course cilia, which will be the same as that of the respiratory epithelial tissue that we find here. Now, again, the next one, which will communicate with actually the larynx, will find itself from the upper border of the epiglottis to the lower border of the cricoid cartilage, and that is because it's communicating behind the larynx. We call it laryngopharynx. Now, oropharynx and of course laryngopharynx will have a common epithelial lining, being actually stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelial tissue. Now, so let's look at some important bits that we can find in the nasopharynx. Now, in the nasopharynx, we are going to find, some tonsils, which are known as, pharyngeal tonsils. Pharyngeal tonsils, around this area, we are going to find pharyngeal tonsils. Remember that these are lymphatic structures which are going to help fight infections. Now, the air is prone to, infections. They could carry pathogens in the air, and therefore we'll have to be guarded actually by some lymphatics, and that is the aggregation of lymphatics is known as nasopharyngeal tonsil. Now, this tonsil will sometimes become infected, and that is what we call adenoids. So over here we are having this elevation over here, which is known as torus tuberous. Okay, torus tuberous. Okay, this mucosal elevation, and it's actually as a result of the opening that you find here, the opening which we call it opening of the pharyngeal tympanic tube, or which is that the ischial tube, that causes the elevation over here, which is known as torus tuberous. Torus tuberous. So that's what we find over here. Now, connecting, actually the torus tuberous, okay, to the pharynx, okay, to the pharynx. Actually, this is coming from the eustachian tube, the elevation over there. So we connecting it, okay, connecting it to the actually the what is the name? The pharynx, around this area, soft palate area, is the salpingo, pharyngeus. Is the salpingo pharyngeus, food, salpingo pharyngeus food. And over here we will have, the salpingo palatine food. So there are two foods. Now, overlying the salpingo pharyngeus food will be the salpingo, pharyngeus muscle. And overlying the salpingo, palatine food will be the belly, palatine, salpingo palatine, belly palatine, right? So that will be levator, belly palatine, actually levator belly palatine will be over here. So that is one thing that we are going to find over here. But there is a recess over here, okay, posterior to the salpingo pharyngeus food will be the fossa of resembula, or the pharyngeus recess, pharyngeal recess, fossa of resembula. So that's what we are going to find over there. Now, around this tubal elevation that we find over here, we are going to find what we call the tubal tonsils as well. The tubal tonsils will also be related here. So that's the main things that we are going to find in the nasopharynx, in the nasopharynx. Now, over here we go to the oropharynx. Now, what are we going to find in the oropharynx? Now, in the oropharynx, yes, we are actually going to find something that two important folds which I want us to know. And these folds, there's one here which actually connects the soft palate actually to the tongue, the soft palate to the tongue, and that is known as the palatoglossal food. Palatoglossal food. This palatoglossal food, yes, actually forms what we call the anterior pillar of forces. Now, they are found on the either side. In between them will be the isthmus, yes, recess, isthmus recess. We're going to find that one there. Now, there is another food which you find it here, actually spanning from the palate once again all the way to what we call the pharynx, and so we call it palatopharyngeus food. Palatopharyngeus food. Now, overlying the palatopharyngeus food will be the palatopharyngeal muscle, pharyngeus muscle, and of course overlying the palatoglossal food will be palatoglossal, glossus muscle. Now, this palatopharyngeus food is known as, represent what we call the posterior pillar of forces. Now, in between them, these two anterior and posterior pillar of forces will be a fossa for the palatine, tonsil, fossa for the palatine. So this is the palatine tonsil that we find over here. Now remember again that behind the posterior one third of the tongue also presents with some kind of mucosal elevation, which we call it lingual tonsil. Now these tonsils actually help to ward off infections and pathogens, so they are very important over here. Now for the rest, I'll talk about more of it when we look at the larynx. But importantly, we've seen this, the epiglottis, and this fold will be the airy epiglottic fold. We'll look at the rest. Of course, we've seen the cricoid cartilage. But one thing that I want to show here is that there's a fossa, or there's a recess between what we call the tongue and the epiglottis. That is known as valleculae. So we look at all those things, the valleculae over here. Valleculae over here. Now, one thing that we want to show over here, now this is the laryngeal inlet to the voice box. Now over here there is a recess. There is a recess over here, and this recess is known as piriformis recess. Piriformis recess. Now this piriformis recess, yes, that's where most of the time, if there is, inhalation, aspiration of some, foreign body, it will get lodged in the piriform recess. Now importantly, if this recess, yes, we want to remove that particular structure from this area, it could injure a nerve known as internal laryngeal nerve. Once this internal laryngeal nerve is injured, then what happens is that the superior portion of the larynx will become insensitive, will lose their sensation. So just to wrap up, what is of importance are these tonsils, which are forming a ring-like process. We've seen the tubal tonsil, we've seen the pharyngeal tonsil, nasopharyngeal tonsil, that's which will become inflamed, forming what we call adenoids. Then of course we are going to also find the palatine tonsil. Of course we are also going to find what we call the lingual tonsil, and together they form a ring known as Walde's ring, so that it can help ward off any infections. All right, so this was actually a quick tutorial trying to look at the conduction portion of the nasal cavity. Importantly, there's nasal cavity, and of course the pharynx. I hope you find it helpful. Thank you very much for your audience.